This is Fusion Capitalism, a clean energy vision for conservatives. Brought to you by industry leader and company CEO, Steve Malink. Here's Steve.
Welcome back to the second part of my conversation with Mike O'Boyle, the Director of Electricity Policy at Energy Innovation and co-author of the fascinating study, the 2035 Report. Plummeting solar, wind, and battery costs can accelerate our clean electricity future. Mike, I want to get into the opinion piece you co-wrote in the Times last year titled, When Will Electricity Companies Finally Quit Natural Gas? Is natural gas as a transitional fuel more than a short-term solution than we thought, maybe just 10 years ago?
Yes, there are a couple of aspects to that. If you just look at the cost paid for electricity, there are situations where building new gas does make sense, but anytime you look at the different resources you have a choice to build, you should also consider, the externalities associated with those resources. And it's not even close if you start to look at the environmental damage that natural gas plants cause, not just climate, mostly climate, but also, some limited particulate emissions, particularly right around the gas plants. But if you're willing to accept that climate change is a serious cost, we know that from the 2035 report that we don't need any new natural gas plants to rapidly decarbonize the electricity system. To the extent we need natural gas for reliability in the times where, wind and solar aren't available like we need them, and you sort of need that long duration dispatchable generation, the existing fleet is enough. And so every investment in new natural gas looks more and more like a stranded asset risk. And at the same time, investors are starting to get really serious about vetting utilities that have heavy positions in fossil and looking for more renewables heavy utilities because they see that as a risk, both a regulatory risk and also a financial risk. The cost declines of renewables and batteries are on a pretty inexorable trend, at least in the next decade. And so this crossover point that we saw between coal and renewables, where the marginal cost doesn't justify its operation, gas is going to hit that at some point. It looks more and more likely. Gas provides a sort of different, more dispatchable, flexible service to the electricity system. And so it's kind of more valuable in a high renewables future than coal ever will be. But it's sort of time to stop digging the hole deeper that we then need to climb out of to have a safe climate future.
Okay. And I meant to ask this question about coal earlier, but last summer you wrote a piece for Forbes titled Solar for Coal Swaps, a financial innovation that could accelerate the carbon transition. Can you tell us more about solar for coal?
Sure. Solar for coal swaps are an emerging financial structure or tool where a third-party financer, in the case of our analysis, this was Guzman Energy, approaches a utility and offers to buy them out of their existing coal contract, offers to sell them solar energy to replace the energy they were buying from the coal plant, and roll that all into one long-term power purchase agreement that is lower cost than the original agreement to buy power. Guzman was approaching a cooperative utility that was buying power from a large generation and transmission cooperative called Tri-State, and they were able to provide the cooperative utility with a lower price and allow them to sort of exit their agreement with Tri-State. It's basically just sort of a swap of the obligations.
I see. Interesting. So the clean energy industry is growing exponentially every year. That is solar and wind power installations. But we have the tax credits associated with those two forms of renewables winding down. Is that going to threaten the future growth, in your opinion?
Well, certainly in the near term, if the production tax credit for wind is not extended beyond 2020, because of the pandemic, I think a safe harbor provision was offered to the utilities so that they could do some construction in 2021. I'm not exactly sure if that was the whole year or some part of it, but yeah, after the expiration of the production tax credit, I would certainly expect, a dip, especially in wind construction.
Mm-hmm.
The point that we argued in the 2035 report was we can really justify a strong federal clean electricity standard, or in aggregate some state electricity standards, because the incremental cost compared to business as usual of achieving 90% clean was so small and actually still resulted in customer savings. Now, if we don't have that policy, we need some policy that compensates for the environmental damage, or better put, that compensates wind and solar for the avoided environmental damage that they provide. And I think the tax credits are a fair way of doing that. It's critically important, I think, that Congress consider extending those in the absence of a strong clean electricity standard, or else, yeah, I don't think the growth will stop, but I don't see it reaching the sort of doubling and sustained doubling that we
Mm-hmm.
need.
Mm-hmm.
The other part of this is making sure that we fix transmission planning and siting so that the grid is built out to access the low cost wind and solar. A lot of these projects are languishing in what are called interconnection queues, either in these regional wholesale markets or with individual utilities, and they can't access the market because the interconnection fees are too high or the studies take too long. And so we need to do some proactive transmission planning and build out in order to make sure the grid can access these highly economic resources.
Okay. You work closely with policymakers, and given that, what are the prospects for the tax credits being extended or renewed for X number of years versus maybe putting a price on carbon versus any other options? You referenced the standard. Is that like a national renewable portfolio standard, I guess?
Mm-hmm.
And does that supplant the need for a tax credit or a price on carbon? Or do they somehow all work together?
I'm not an adept political prognosticator, so I couldn't tell you specifically, what's more likely to pass or be included. I know that economic recovery is the priority for the administration. To the extent we are stuck with a Republican Senate, and I only use the word stuck in the sense of, they've been mostly, I think, hostile to action on climate change. I would say a federal clean electricity standard is highly unlikely, at least to be passed legislatively. I think there's
Mm-hmm.
probably things the Biden administration can do administratively, to revive certain parts of not the Clean Power Plan specifically, but Clean Air Act regulation
Mm-hmm.
of big emitters in the power sector. If there were to be a clean electricity standard, my recommendation would be, that's enough of a forcing function that we could probably live without the tax credits. We don't need both. The tax credits would reduce the cost, right, of the transition, but our modeling had the tax credits phasing out as scheduled, and so you still get those savings without them. So you don't really
I
need
see.
them. But in the absence of the clean electricity standard, yeah, you absolutely need to look at extending the tax credits and ideally making them refundable. The tax equity industry is taking quite a bit off the top. Sometimes, about a third of the federal dollars actually
Mm-hmm.
flow to financiers like Goldman
Mm-hmm.
Sachs instead of the
Mm-hmm.
actual developers. So that really undercuts the effectiveness of these policies. So
I
we should
see.
probably
Yeah.
stop doing that.
Mike, it's been great talking to you. This has been a very important and timely conversation. His name is Mike O'Boyle, the Director of Electricity Policy at Energy Innovation and co-author of the 2035 report, Plummeting Solar, Wind, and Battery Costs Can Accelerate Our Clean Electricity Future. Mike, thanks for joining me.
I really appreciate the chance to talk with you, Steve. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for listening to Fusion Capitalism. To find out more about Steve Malink and his book, go to fusioncapitalism.com. This has been a production of Forbes Books Radio.